despite what the odds makers have to say, they're still going to play this one for the ACC championship. Pitt at 7-5 taking on Clemson, and of course, little chance given to the Panthers for this one, but they will tow it up for the first time for an ACC championship game. We bring in a longtime guest here, Jim Hammett. You can catch him on the Rivals platform for Pitt football, Panther Lair. Jim, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. A little snowy up in Pennsylvania today, but it is the season.
That's what I understand. We got blasted here in Connecticut about 2 weeks ago, but it's been cold. But the snow has held off. But I see the video from further west, out in the Midwest and even in Pennsylvania. So yeah, winter's taken hold very quickly. Fortunately for you, you got something to look forward to this Saturday. Let's talk about this Pitt football team, because I'm going to take a little credit here, not necessarily that I believed it, but with Miami faltering very early in the ACC schedule as being the team that everybody just automatically placed in the ACC championship game the entire offseason. Looking at the standings, once a few pegs fell just very early in the schedule, I certainly threw out the possibility, despite the woes in the non-conference schedule, that Pitt was a pretty solid football team developing every week, and maybe they could make a run at this.
Yeah, I kind of always thought that was a possibility as well, because, outside of Miami, heading into the year, I thought everyone was pretty even. I thought Virginia Tech, they had a lot of offseason troubles. Nobody gave Virginia a lot of love, but of course they made their run. But aside from that, Pitt has had some success against Georgia Tech. They always struggle with North Carolina for whatever reason, but, North Carolina, Duke, nobody was really jumping out as someone that they could win the Coastal. So I think it kind of just everything worked out well, and they got hot at the right time. I know the non-conference schedule was rough, but I think it almost prepared them a little bit for, you play Penn State, you play Central Florida, Notre Dame. Whenever you face against those teams and you go up against Virginia and Duke, it doesn't quite feel as hard.
Absolutely. That was the toughest non-conference schedule in the country, bar none. I don't think it's really that close to take on those three teams that are currently ranked in the top 12 in the country. Of course, the showings against Penn State and UCF were rough, as you mentioned, but to go to Notre Dame and take it down to the last possession of the game was pretty impressive at the time for a team that was rolling, and still is, as the first team to clinch basically a college football playoff position. So you mentioned, I think this outlines the Coastal Division for us. Pitt wins the Coastal. They lose to North Carolina, who lost the rest of its ACC games, 0-7 in the ACC. Virginia beats Virginia, or Virginia Tech beats Virginia, but you could just muddle it all together. But what the result is 6-2 in the division, 6-2 in the conference, and the team isn't dynamic in any particular area. But what I was impressed with is that they know their identity and they play that way each and every game.
Yeah, absolutely. Pitt is ranked 18th in the country in rushing yardage, and the team is built to play that way. They have two senior backs. Qadree Ollison, he was a star as a freshman, kind of got lost in the shuffle the past 2 years, and now he had a great year. Darren Hall had some moments last year, maybe a few before that, but he's another senior. And it's going to be the first time when Darren Hall does break into the 1,000 yards. If he does, I think he's about 60, 65 yards short. It'll be the first time Pitt has ever had two 1,000-yard backs in the same team. So that would be rather impressive. But, that's what they do. They have four senior offensive linemen. They have two senior running backs, a quarterback that's kind of a game manager, not a ton of dynamic athletes on the outside. So, you put that all together, and what are they? They're a very good running team, but, and that's kind of how they've played this whole season.
Yeah, this Qadree Ollison, just his entire career has been kind of fascinating to me, because if people remember and were paying attention at the time, I know because it involved James Conner coming off the field in week 1 against Youngstown State. We know, most of us as football fans, the storyline for James Conner, and it's been an inspiring one, who now stars for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Ollison was the back then. And then, as you mentioned, he gets lost in the shuffle after having a very prominent freshman campaign, and now he reemerges as a senior as a 1,000-yard back.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy because, you look at Pitt's running back history, and it's, one of the best, historically. I mean, you have some great running backs, and he is just the sixth Pitt running back to have two separate 1,000-yard seasons. And you look at some of the names that have done it: the Tony Dorsetts, Dion Lewis, LaShawn McCoy, I believe Curtis Martin. I mean, they've had some really good running backs, and at a time after that freshman season, you never really expected Ollison to get back, because Connor came back for his senior year, kind of put Ollison to the bench, and he struggled last year, but he had a great year this year. He kind of transformed his body. He kind of went from that bruising power back to, he had a 97-yard run against Virginia Tech, which is the longest play in Pitt football history. He showed a little burst there. So I think he went from a guy that, he was just a guy that could carry the ball to, maybe a guy that has an NFL future now. And I don't know if anyone really thought that in August.
Yeah, and you mentioned Darren Hall's quest to become the second 1,000-yard rusher with a 965 or 935 right now. What jumps out is the 7.6 yards per carry is pretty exceptional. You don't see that outside the Big 12 or the Mountain West against these kind of defenses.
Yeah, it was crazy. I mean, going back to that Virginia Tech game, Pitt actually set a school record for most yards in a game. And it was really, Hall and Ollison that kind of did all the work. I think Hall had close to 200 yards on 7 carries. I mean, he was just every run was just this huge run, and Ollison was doing the same thing. So, I mean, it's incredible, but the line has done a really good job. And the line was actually the big question mark coming into the season.
So we had a vice versa, inverse type situation last weekend where in 2017, Pitt pulls off the upset. They're out of the race, can't even make a bowl game. They pull off the upset against an undefeated Miami team headed to the ACC championship game. This year, Pitt unexpectedly already has the division wrapped up, which was even more so unexpected, not even needing to win a game at the end. And they go to Miami. Was it just kind of Miami? We know what the talent is, especially on defense for the Canes, and it just coming together that it was maybe a C effort for Pitt against a close to A effort for Miami?
Yeah, I don't think Pitt played very well, but at the same time, Miami's strength is that defensive front seven. They have a couple guys that are going to play in the NFL next season. So I think that was part of it. Pitt did lose its starting center, Jimmy Morriseey, before the game. So that caused a left guard having to move to center and a new left guard to come on the field. And I think they felt that a little bit. So, Miami, they kind of were there to stop the run, and they kind of dared Kenny Pickett to throw, and he just didn't have a lot of success, and he didn't really have a lot of time either. Miami was really just sending pressure. So it was a good game plan by Miami. And I don't know if Pitt was looking ahead to the Clemson game, but at the same time, it was a big deal for Pitt to win the Coastal, and the Clemson game, it is a big deal as well. So maybe some guys were peeking ahead, but Miami played very well.
Got Jim Hammett on the line. You can join him on Rivals. The Pitt site there is Panther Lair, and Jim has joined us for a number of years talking Pitt Panther football. And of course, this is the highest we have seen, not record-wise, but in regards to playing for a championship out of Pitt football for quite some time. You mentioned the loss of Morriseey, so I'm checking out the injury list here, and it appears to be an ankle that will take him out for the entire season. So obviously that's a concern.
Yeah, absolutely. Jimmy Morriseey was actually a walk-on from Philadelphia when he came to Pitt. And as a redshirt freshman, he actually won the job. So he started all 12 games last year and the first 11 this year. And, he is the only non-senior starter on the offensive line. So he's expected to be the anchor for the next 2 years. He actually turned out to be a really good player. So it did cause a little bit of reshuffling. Connor Dentino's had a really nice year at left guard, but he had to play center. Bryce Hargrove has kind of been an extra blocker, the sixth man, so to speak, on the offensive line. So he did have some, playing experience, but again, it's different coming in sub packages than, having to see the Miami defensive line for 4 quarters.
I'm checking out the game log here and trying to think back where I've caught Pitt play this year. I remember checking in late against Georgia Tech and against North Carolina because those were 1-score games that I wanted to see how they finished out. The Penn State score was a complete debacle in terms of 51-6, but it was like a 7-6 game deep into the second quarter. People might be surprised by that. I saw some of the note. I actually watched the Notre Dame game just a few days ago on replay. I wanted to see, one of those 30-minute cut down versions to see how Pitt played in that game and how they hung in there. And I'm looking at Kenny Pickett's game log. I'm a bit surprised in regards to some of the responses I've gotten from Pitt fans that they throw out the term garbage, and I hate to hear that from any sports fan because I remember him obviously making his first start last year against Miami, playing extremely well, managing the game, getting outside the pocket, beating Miami with his legs and his arm, just really managing the game well. A week after, he led the team down the field and played really well against Virginia Tech. And then based statistically on what I would expect out of Kenny Pickett, it appears as though he's played pretty much a Kenny Pickett type of season, what you would expect. Your thoughts about his play?
Yeah, I would say, Kenny Pickett takes care of the ball. He's been able to orchestrate this running offense. The passing game hasn't quite been there yet this season. I don't know if it's on him. Some would blame the offensive coordinator. Some would blame the pass blocking because the offensive line's more geared to, run the ball. But whatever it is, I don't think Kenny Pickett has been as bad as some have claimed this year. He had a really nice game against Wake Forest because 2 weeks ago, Wake Forest kind of shut down the running game, and they needed Kenny Pickett to throw the ball, and he had 3 second-half touchdowns. He made some big throws in that game. He's a little mobile. He can make a run if he has to. So I think as a sophomore in his first year as a full-time starter, it hasn't been perfect. It's had its ups and downs, but I think going into next year and his senior year, I think there's something to work with, and they didn't have that benefit going into this year. All they had was that Miami game to work with.
We're joined by Jim Hammett. He's a writer for Rivals Pitt site, Panther Lair. So please join him there for Pitt football coverage. Of course, the Panthers playing their most important game in years, taking on Clemson. And many of us will think back to the upset a couple of years ago against a Clemson team that eventually won the national championship, and Pitt going to Clemson and winning that game in dramatic fashion, I believe 43-42. Let's talk some defense, Jim. And of course, that's Pat Narduzzi's calling card. And many of us have been either critical or just a bit lost in regards to the lack of development on that side of the ball for a couple of years in terms of what we would have expected. And even I think it was 2 years ago, the team actually turning into a pass happy team that had to outscore teams, and it not being the kind of molded team that you would expect from Narduzzi, but things have shifted, and this has played out to be the type team you would expect him to recruit, sign, and then develop on the field.
Yeah, I think the defense still isn't great. I mean, they're still giving up big plays and what have you, but they have some more playmakers on that side of the ball. That 2016 team, it was fun to watch, but you just kind of maybe they would force a punt every once in a while. Maybe they would luck into an interception. That's not the case this year. I mean, they can get off the field when they have to sometimes. They have some good players. Rashad Weaver's a good defensive end. DeMar Hamlin's having a nice year at safety. Dane Jackson's a pretty good corner. So it's slowly getting there. It's not, I think that 2016 team, it was one of the 5 worst defenses in college football. I think it's probably ranked around the 80s right now. And, that's still not good, but it's better than what it has been. And I think that that's allowed for them to, win a couple games this year they may not have in the past.
All right, Jim, the realistic Pitt fan. First of all, what's the formula for the victory? And aside from pulling off a stunner that most of us would, I haven't looked at the line, but based on what Clemson's done the last several weeks and what the line has been against good teams like Duke, which is comparable to Pitt, although I believe Pitt must have won that game, head to head. Then the other game being that stands out is obviously the last game against South Carolina as a 25 or 26 point favorite against a team that's going to play in postseason play. The line's got to be about 4 touchdowns in this one, I would expect. So first of all, what's the formula for the victory, for the stunner? And then also, what would be a satisfying result outside of the shocking in regards to a Pitt fan coming away thinking, okay, I feel good about the way we performed on the big stage?
Yeah, I mean, if they are going to pull off the upset, I think they're going to need both facets of the offense to work, because in order to beat Clemson, you're going to have to keep the ball out of their hands somewhat. And I think that's what Pitt did against Notre Dame to an extent. They had a really long scoring drive against the Irish, and they need to do that again. They need Qadree, Ollison, and Darren Hall to both have big games. They need to control the ball on offense, but also, Clemson has a great rushing defense. So you're not going to be able to do that all day. So you're going to need Kenny Pickett to make a couple throws. And, I guess defensively, you kind of have to hope maybe Trevor Lawrence makes some mistakes. He is a freshman. I know he's a great freshman, but you kind of just have to hope in a championship game with the country watching, maybe he makes a bad throw or two. But at the end of the day, Clemson's going to win the game. It's going to take a lot for Pitt to win this. So I think Pitt fans would probably be happy if it's a game at halftime, or if it's a game going into the fourth quarter, and if Clemson pulls away and wins by 21, 24 points in the end, so be it. But if it's competitive and it's not just Clemson's up 21-0, after one, I think Pitt fans will at least accept that.
And that's something similar to what we've seen a couple weeks ago against Duke. In particular, it was a 7-6 game at half. It turned out 35-6, but certainly Duke was in it midway through the third quarter. And this last weekend against South Carolina, I believe a one-score game, and Clemson was fully in control, but at the same time, there was a chance for South Carolina to do something throughout the game, and losing by 21. I see the line started at 23, and the public has betted this up to about 26.5 right now, as expected. More importantly, Jim, probably is the question, is this sustainable? Meaning you don't want to go to an ACC championship game, lose by 5 touchdowns, and then be 5-7 next year. How does the future look in regards to sustaining contention in the Coastal?
Yeah, I mean, Pitt's going to have a new look next year, with both running backs being seniors, a lot of senior offensive linemen, but they're going to have Kenny Pickett back. They are going to have Maurice French and Tayseer Mack, their top 2 receivers, back. He's recruited some very good running backs. There's some guys, 4-star recruits in the fold. So I think the offense can kind of find an identity next year. And I think the defense is still always going to be a little bit of a work in progress. But I think the schedule next year is a little bit softer. You don't have Notre Dame, and you get Central Florida at home. So I think it's a reasonable thing to expect, 7-5, 8-4 again next year, if not a little bit better. At some point, I think Pat Narduzzi does need to kind of break into that 9-10 win season. Not every year, but, every couple years.
Jim Hammett joining us from Panther Lair. It's the Rivals platform for Pitt Panther football. Of course, Pitt lines up against the number 2 ranked Clemson Tigers for the ACC championship game on Saturday night. Jim, we always appreciate you stopping by.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me.